Today's episode is brought to you by Forvis Mazars.
SoundCartel.
From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. Are you suffering from AI FOMO? With the huge array of AI benefits being bandied about, how real are they? Or is much of it just hype? Well, McEwen offers a calm, grounded assessment of how to approach AI for small businesses. Aaron is Vice President of Research and Advisory at global research network Gartner, and he explains how a cautious adoption of the technology can offer benefits to many, if not most, small enterprises. He starts by describing the current situation to Jeff Waters.
I mean, it's hard to get an accurate read on, for example, the percentages of small businesses that might be using it. The kind of usage or popularity of the technology within medium to large enterprises is easier to come across. So it's just easier to get that data. But there is some anecdotal evidence that small businesses that are investing in the technology are perhaps getting greater and faster gains. One of the things that's happening for larger enterprises is that they're approaching what in Gartner we refer to as the trough of disillusionment. And what I mean by that is that all emerging technologies tend to go through a predictable adoption curve. So it starts off with an insight or an innovation, and then it quickly hypes up to the point where people start to see this as, this is the best thing since sliced bread. It's going to revolutionize industry. And then quite quickly it tips over into a slope down into this trough of disillusionment. And that's typically where we realize that maybe it's more expensive, maybe it's more difficult, more time consuming, more resource intensive than we expected it to be. And maybe it doesn't do everything as well as we had hoped it would. So that's where a lot of large enterprises caught in this. Actually, this is expensive and it takes a lot to get the workforce to adopt it and get used to it. So typically smaller businesses aren't really encumbered by those kind of complex change management issues that large enterprises do. So they also lack some of the governance structures. So what I'd say is they may be moving faster, but there are a lot of risks to moving quickly with the technology. But they are, at least anecdotally, appear to be making more progress, at least the early adopters of the technology in small business.
I love the term trough of disillusionment. It sounds like something a 19th century ship's captain would have named on the Australian coast. The trough of disillusionment, is that going to happen with AI? Is that inevitable that we will find that it isn't as fantastic as everybody is predicting?
Well, firstly, it probably helps to separate AI from generative AI. So they often get kind of lumped in together, but they are different and they solve different problems. So just for the sake of, clarity, let's talk about generative AI because that's where all of the hype has been over the last 12 months.
Chat GPT and all of that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So in the context of that, we know that it's already moving into the trough of disillusionment. It's not quite there yet, but you'll see that. It's not being spoken about as often in the media. One of the things we do at Gartner is we obviously track the questions that our clients pose to us. So the volume of questions about artificial intelligence or generative AI is going down in volume. So that's a good indication that the hype is kind of dissipating from the conversation. It's important to note, though, that, what relatively quickly happens with this is that once we do work out the bugs, the cost of implementation and the cost of the technology starts to drop. It very quickly moves into what we call the plateau of productivity. And that's where it becomes mainstreamed. It's embedded in the way that we work. So
I want to know how to get to the peak of ecstasy.
I'm not sure it ever gets there. Yeah, maybe
Never gets there?
Well, I think the peak of inflated expectations is the peak of, very few things are as good as sliced bread. And we learned that.
So you mentioned that anecdotally it was being employed very well in some places. Can you tell us more, expand on that about those anecdotes? And for a small business listener thinking, well, I'm not into this yet, how do I get into it and how do I exploit it?
Well, with all technologies, there's usually a group of early adopters. So, we have seen some smaller organizations adopt the technology early. The way in which they're using it is very dependent upon the problems that they're trying to solve in their organization. But I think a really good example might be in B2B marketing, for example. Some organizations have made great progress in terms of automating those processes and being able to augment the work that their salespeople might be doing or their marketers might be doing. So there's lots of different areas where organizations are making progress.
So what sort of examples can you have of success stories in this realm?
It's probably too early to say full success stories, but certainly what we're seeing is pockets of innovation that are being driven by this. And usually in the context of smaller organizations, that's got to do with increasing the productivity of their workforce, for example. Other organizations have applied the technology to automate things like an HR function where one hasn't existed before. There's certainly some really exciting stuff happening in terms of inbound call centers, for example. So smaller organizations that have small teams of inbound call centers, this technology is being used to automate some of those processes, but also augment the customer service experience that customers are getting.
Fascinating. So a mixture between a computer response and a human response.
Yeah, and I think, that's where we'll see probably the biggest impacts of a technology like generative AI is more in the augmentation. So it's where some processes are automated or semi-automated, but there is human oversight and human interaction within that customer exchange, for example.
It's all a very brave new world, Aaron, for many people. What would you say to people, maybe, and I don't mean to be unfair here, but in the older age brackets who might be intimidated by all of this? Is this something that we should all be embracing, or can we get away with ignoring it?
Probably depends on the day that you catch me, whether I see this as, whether I'm feeling particularly pessimistic or optimistic. I say that a little bit tongue-in-cheek. What I would say is that historically, emerging technologies tend to be net creators of jobs, not net destroyers of jobs. So, we know, for example, that one of the most prominent fears that employees have about the technology is that it's going to replace them. So what we find is that kind of rarely happens wholesale. There might be, specific jobs that are largely automated. But what tends to happen is that it impacts everybody's job. And what it looks like is happening with this technology, which is consistent with others that we've seen historically, is that it's pushing work further up the complexity bar. So work becomes more complex. As things are automated, those things tend to be the simpler tasks, the repeatable tasks. And what that does is it leaves space, and that space is filled by more complex things. But to answer your question directly, the best advice I can give to, business leaders or older workers, mature workers, for example, is to be curious. As a child, I kind of noticed the time in which my grandparents stopped listening to new music and stopped buying new clothes. So I think, we all approach that point where it's like, I don't think I really understand this newfangled music that the kids are playing. So my best advice is lean into that. Be curious about it. And there's ways that you can interact with AI and generative AI in your everyday life. So most people would have heard of things like a HomePod or an Alexa or a Google Assistant. This is incredibly advanced artificial intelligence and increasingly generative AI technology that's being utilized. So that's an easy way where, you can just lean into the technology every day. And I think be optimistic. If you can imagine a time where you're speaking to your Google Assistant, for example, and you're asking it to, you could, for example, say something like, I've just had something come up. Can you cancel all of my upcoming appointments, reschedule these 3 because they're really important? And your little AI agent will go off and do that for you. So that isn't here yet, but it's probably coming as a result of this technology. So focusing on the ways in which this technology can help improve the way that you work, the way that it can help remove drudgery from your job, the irritation of the little administrative tasks that maybe you don't enjoy. that future is coming.
That's Aaron McEwen, Vice President of Research and Advisory for Gartner. Business Essentials Daily is a SoundCartel podcast. Producers are Nick Schildberger, Chris Ashmore, Jeff Waters and myself. Technical production by Pete Letts. I'm Nicole Goodman. Thanks for listening. We'll bring you more Be Daily next week. SoundCartel. This episode was brought to you by Forvis Mazars. To find out more, visit forvismazars.com/au. That's FORVISMAZARS.com/au.